I was 18 years old, and that morning, the wind across the white mountains blew as if it wanted to bury even the sound of my children's cries. Snow whipped against my face, sharp as tiny knives, every breath turning into white smoke that dissolved into the air heavy with pine resin and rust. The rope cut deep into my wrists, the skin already swollen and raw from the night before. My body shook, not only from the cold but from the knowledge that I was not meant to survive. They had left me here to die. My two daughters, Naili and Tallulah, were bundled inside a ragged blanket, squirming weakly. Their cries were fading, breaking into short whimpers like rain-soaked sparrows. I bent my head to press my lips against their foreheads, but my mouth was cracked, dry, unable to offer warmth. For a moment, I wondered if it might be kinder for silence to swallow us all, because then I wouldn't have to keep hearing the voices of my husband's family echoing in my skull. Girls are nothing. They eat, but they bring nothing back. I remembered the night before, when they dragged me out of the lodge. The wind had screamed just like it did now. They said they had no more use for me, no use for daughters. To them, my girls were nothing but empty mouths. I did not resist. I only clutched them tighter, staring at the last flicker of firelight in the camp before darkness and snow erased it from sight. My whole body felt heavy as stone. I thought I would die standing, my feet frozen into the ground. I was ready to let the earth swallow me and my daughters together. But then, a sound broke through. At first, I thought it was only the wind shifting through the pines. But no, there was rhythm in it. Steady, certain, hoofbeats, distant, then closer, pounding like my own heart trying to tear free from my chest. I closed my eyes tight, begging that it wasn't the red horsemen returning to finish what they had started. The horse whinnied once, low, then fell silent. The wind carried only its echo. And then, through the white haze, a shadow moved. He emerged from the snow, tall and broad, his coat heavy with frost, hat pulled low to hide most of his face. He dismounted slowly, each step sinking into the drifts with a deliberate weight, as if time itself had slowed so I could take in the shape of him. When he bent toward me, his eyes caught the light, not cold like the snow, not blazing like fire, but heavy, steady, like stone. I didn't know if he was a savior or another danger. The man bent down, and his eyes were not as cold as the snow, but heavy like the weight of the earth itself. For a moment, I couldn't move. My arms were stiff from the rope, my body trembling from exhaustion, but it was fear that rooted me in place. Men had never come to me bearing kindness. Why should this one be different? He said nothing. His breath came out in a cloud as he crouched, pulling a knife from his belt. My heart hammered. I thought of steel sinking into me, ending what little was left. Instead, I felt the rope slacken, and my arms dropped like broken branches at my sides. Pain seared through as blood began to flow again. The man looked at me once, then at my daughters. They whimpered weakly in the blanket, their tiny faces pale against the snow. His jaw tightened, but he did not speak. He pulled another blanket from his saddle, coarse wool patched in places, and wrapped it around them with a strange care. I wanted to protest, to tell him not to touch what little I had left, but my voice was gone. My throat felt full of sand. He lifted the girls as if they were made of glass, slid them carefully into a fold of his coat, and then turned back to me. I should have fought. I should have pulled away. But when he reached for me, I could not even lift my hand. My legs crumpled beneath me, and he caught me before I hit the snow. His arms were strong, smelling of leather, smoke, and pine. For the first time since my marriage, someone held me without cruelty. He carried us to his horse. The mare snorted, her breath steaming, stamping the frozen ground. He shifted me sideways across the saddle, then placed the bundle of my daughters against my chest, wrapping the reins around one hand. He mounted behind me, the creak of leather loud in the stillness. The world swayed as the horse began to move. My head lolled against his chest, the rhythm of his breathing steady in my ear. The trees slid past, their black trunks stark against the white. I tried to mark the trail, to remember which way he was taking me, but the snow blurred everything into one endless sheet. Hours seemed to stretch and fold. My eyelids drooped, but I fought sleep. I didn't know this man. I didn't know his name or his heart. For all I knew, he could be leading me to another kind of prison. At last, I saw it. A cabin tucked into the trees, smoke thin from its chimney, walls half buried in snow. He dismounted, then lifted me down with the same quiet strength as before. My legs buckled, but he steadied me without a word. The door groaned as he pushed it open with his boot. Warmth hit my face like a wave would smoke, the faint scent of stew, the promise of survival. My daughters stirred, their cries sharper now, hungry. He set me on a cot near the window, then placed the girls beside me. I tried to speak, to ask who he was, why he had done this, but the words snagged in my throat. He busied himself instead, feeding the fire, setting water to heat, moving with the ease of a man used to silence. I pulled my daughters closer, heart pounding. My body screamed for rest, but my mind spun in fear. I had been left to die. Now I had been taken again, and I didn't know if I had been saved or captured. The first thing I noticed was the sound. Not the wind anymore, not the sharp cry of snow against the roof, but the steady crackle of fire. It filled the cabin like a low heartbeat, warming the air, carrying with it the smell of resin and ash. I sat on the narrow cot, my daughters pressed against me, and tried to understand where I was. The walls were rough-hewn pine, patched in places, solid in others. A stove hunched in the corner, iron black, with a kettle already beginning to whisper steam. The stranger moved around the room with the quiet certainty of someone who belonged here. He said nothing. I said nothing. Silence was safer. The twins cried, their tiny mouths rooting, searching. Panic rose in me. I had nothing left to give them. My milk had dried days ago. My chest ached with emptiness. I clutched them tighter, rocking as if motion alone could feed them. Shame burned my cheeks hotter than the fire. The man noticed. He opened a tin, poured pale liquid into 2 small jars, and warmed them near the stove. When he brought them to me, I recoiled at first, but the cries of my daughters cut sharper than my fear. I held the jars, one in each hand, trembling as I tipped them to their lips. They drank greedily. Their eyes fluttered shut, their little fists uncurled. Relief rushed through me so strong I nearly wept. I whispered their names into their hair, soft as prayer. Nayeli, Tallulah. When I looked up, he was watching. His face was still shadowed beneath his hat, but his eyes were steady. He wasn't staring at me the way men had before, hungry or cruel. He was only watching to see if the children would live through the night. I turned away, but something inside me loosened, just slightly. Later, when the girls slept, I lay back on the cot. My wrists throbbed from the rope burns, my shoulders bruised, my temples still crusted with dried blood. He must have seen the state of me, but he said nothing, only pulled a quilt over my body before returning to the fire. I drifted in and out of sleep, the rhythm of the crackling wood lulling me. Once, I stirred and saw him sitting near the stove, his rifle leaned against the wall, his hat tilted low. He wasn't asleep. He was watching the flames, unmoving, as if guarding them, or us. For years I had lived surrounded by people, yet never felt safe. Tonight, in this cabin with a man whose name I didn't even know, safety flickered like a fragile flame. I didn't trust it, but I couldn't ignore it. Before dawn, I woke to the sound of the fire being stirred. He rose and placed another log onto the coals, the sparks leaping like fireflies. He moved as if he had done this every day of his life, as if tending fire was a ritual. I pressed my hand to my daughters, feeling their tiny chests rise and fall. The world outside was still ice and silence, but in here, breath and warmth held steady. I did not yet know this man, but I knew I was no longer alone. By morning, the pain returned in full. My wrists burned when I tried to lift the girls, the raw skin stinging with every movement. My ankles throbbed where the ropes had cut, and the bruise on my temple pulsed like a drumbeat. I wanted to hide it, to bury the weakness deep, the way I had always been taught. Apache women were not meant to show pain. But when I tried to stand, the room tilted. I gripped the wall to keep from falling, and he was suddenly there, steadying me with one arm. I pulled away too quickly, wincing as fire shot through my muscles. His brow furrowed, but he said nothing. Instead, he dipped a rag into warm water and held it out. I hesitated, then took it, pressing it gently to my face. The warmth seeped into me, loosening the cold that had clung to my skin for days. Why? The word escaped before I could stop it. My voice was rough, hardly more than a whisper. Why help me? He didn't answer at once. He crouched near the fire, poking the logs until sparks leapt up the chimney. Finally, in a voice as low as the crackle of wood, he said, "Because no one should be left to die in the snow." Simple words, nothing more. But they landed in me like stones dropped into a deep pool. I looked away, ashamed of the heat rising in my cheeks. No one had spoken for my worth in years, not my husband, not his kin, not even my own blood. My daughters had been called curses before they had drawn their first breath. And yet this stranger, who owed me nothing, who didn't even know my name, had chosen to pull us from the edge. Still, suspicion coiled inside me. I had been saved only to be caged before. I had learned that kindness often carried a cost. The girls stirred, small cries filling the cabin. He rose without a word, retrieving the jars again, mixing goat's milk with water, setting them by the fire until they warmed. When he handed them to me, his hands brushed mine. Rough, calloused, steady. I flinched anyway. He noticed, but didn't react. He only stepped back, giving me space. That alone unsettled me more than if he had pressed closer. As I fed the twins, I studied him in the dim light. His hair was dark, longer than most white men's I had seen, with strands damp from melted snow. His clothes were worn but cared for, the leather mended, the fabric patched. He moved with the silence of a man used to being alone. At last, I whispered, "My name is Ahioka." He paused, then nodded once. "James." Only that. No clan, no family, no place he claimed. Just James. The fire popped, startling the girls, and I rocked them gently until they quieted. My chest ached with something I couldn't name. Gratitude, maybe. Fear, still. And beneath both, the faintest ember of trust, so fragile it could be snuffed out with a single wrong breath. That night, I lay awake long after the cabin fell silent, listening to the rhythm of his movements as he checked the door, adjusted the fire, then settled into the chair near the stove. He did not speak, and neither did I. But in the hush between us, I felt a strange truth. The wounds on my skin would heal. The ones inside me, I wasn't so sure. Days passed, though I could not count them clearly. The snow outside remained thick, the sky always pale, the hours blurred between firelight and shadows. Yet my body, broken and raw when he found me, began to mend. The swelling in my wrists faded from purple to yellow. The cuts on my ankles scabbed, the bruise on my temple softened. Each morning, when I opened my eyes and saw my daughters still breathing beside me, I whispered thanks under my breath. James spoke little. At first I thought it was because he had no words, but I came to realize it was because he chose silence. His quiet wasn't heavy, not like the silence of my husband's family, the kind that punished, that pressed down like a stone. James' silence was different. It left room for the fire to speak, for the children to cry, for my own breath to matter. He worked without asking. Each dawn, he stoked the fire before I even stirred, then split wood outside with a rhythm that echoed through the cabin walls. He carried water, repaired the roof, fixed the hinges on the door. He never demanded help, but when my strength returned enough to hold a bucket, he handed it to me with a single nod. The weight steadied me more than any words could. I began to notice the small things he did. When I undressed the twins, he stepped outside, giving me privacy without making it a spectacle. When I dropped a scrap of cloth, he picked it up quietly, setting it back beside me without comment. Once, I found two little wooden rattles on the windowsill, carved from pine, their handles etched with tiny flowers. He never said they were his doing, but I knew. One evening, I dared to speak more than a whisper. "You treat them as if they matter." And he looked up from the stove, where he was stirring a pot of beans. "They do." Simple, final, no space for argument. The girls grew stronger. Their cheeks flushed pink, their cries louder now. I began to call them my snowbirds, tiny creatures who had survived the storm. When they slept, I mended cloth with thread he had brought from town, humming the old songs of my people under my breath. For the first time in months, the songs did not taste like grief. One night, As the wind rattled against the shutters, I studied him across the firelight. His hair caught the glow, his face calm, his shoulders broad and steady. He looked like a man who had lived too long with only his own company, but had not grown cruel from it. I thought of asking why he lived alone, why his eyes carried such weight. But I didn't. Some silences were better left intact. Instead, I whispered, almost to myself, maybe the snow won't last forever. And, for the first time, I saw the corner of his mouth shift, the ghost of a smile. That night, I slept more deeply than I had in years. Not because the wounds on my body had healed, but because the cabin no longer felt like a place I had been carried into. It was beginning to feel dangerously, impossibly like a place I might belong. By the end of the second week, my legs steadied enough to carry me outside. The air was still sharp, but the snow had begun to soften at the edges, crust breaking beneath my boots as I walked toward the well with the bucket James had given me. My daughters slept inside, wrapped in his old flannel. The sky was wide and clean, a pale blue stretched thin over the pines. For a moment, I felt something close to peace. My arms ached under the weight of the water, but it was a good ache, one that reminded me I was still alive, still moving. I turned back toward the cabin and froze. A woman stood at the edge of the trail, her mule stamping the ground, her bonnet stiff against the wind. She was older, her lips pressed thin, her eyes sharp enough to cut bark from a tree. She watched me the way a hawk watches a rabbit, not with hunger, but with judgment. "Well," she said, her voice like dry twigs snapping, "you look far too alive for someone who was meant to be buried by her husband's kin." The bucket slipped in my grip, splashing water across my skirt. My throat closed. How did she know? Who was she? Her gaze flicked past me, toward the cabin. "Is James inside?" I nodded before I could stop myself. Her smirk deepened, curling like smoke. "People are talking about him keeping an Indian girl out here with two nameless babes. About what it means." She sniffed, adjusting the reins of her mule. "A name doesn't count for much when you've no ring on your finger, dear." The words stung worse than the winter wind. She turned her mule deliberately, slow enough that her meaning clung in the air long after she left. I stood frozen, my hands tight around the bucket. Shame pressed down on me, hot and choking. I had thought I was invisible here, hidden in the trees, forgotten by the world. But the world had found me again. When I returned to the cabin, James was already at the window, his eyes following the woman's retreating shape. He didn't speak. He only took the bucket from my trembling hands and set it aside. That night, I sat by the fire long after the girls had fallen asleep, twisting the hem of my skirt between my fingers. "Finally," I whispered, "they will never stop reminding me that I don't belong." James didn't look up from the hinge he was fixing. His voice was quiet, steady. "You belong here." And I shook my head. "Not here. Not in this cabin. Not in this town. Not anywhere." He set the hinge down carefully, as if laying down a weapon. "I don't answer to towns." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that unsettled me. I searched his face for mockery, for pity, for anything cruel, but there was nothing. Only that steady calm, like stone weathered by years of wind. Still, doubt gnawed at me. The woman's voice echoed in my head, sharp and merciless. No matter how many fires James built, no matter how many rattles he carved for the girls, the world outside would always see me as less. And I feared the day it would come knocking harder than before. The woman's visit lingered in my mind like smoke that would not clear. Each word she'd spoken clung to me shameful, heavy, true in the way only cruelty can be. That night, while the twins slept, I sat staring into the fire, unable to quiet the storm inside me. James was near the door, working at the hinge with slow, careful movements. The scrape of metal against wood filled the room, steady as a heartbeat. For a long while, I said nothing, but the words pressed too hard against my chest, and at last they spilled out. "They'll never see me as anything but filth," I whispered. "A mouth that shouldn't be fed. A body that only brought forth daughters, and nothing worth keeping." His hand stilled. He looked at me then, not quickly, not with surprise, but with a slow, deliberate gaze that felt heavier than any words. "I know what it's like," he said finally, "to be alone so long you stop hearing your own name." I turned toward him, startled. His voice was low, steady, but there was no mistaking the truth in it. "I know what it's like to have silence point at you like a curse," he continued. "To be looked at as something broken because you don't fit the shape others demand." The fire cracked between us. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. His eyes held me, not in chains but in recognition. He nodded toward the cradle where my daughters slept, tiny fists curled. "I ain't never raised babies, but I know enough to see they're not curses." His voice hardened slightly. "They're the only thing in this world that ain't wrong." My throat tightened, and for a moment I could not breathe. No one not once had spoken of my daughters that way. He reached into his coat pocket and slid something across the table. A small jar, the glass clouded, filled with pale cream. "Heard you missed it," he murmured. My hands trembled as I took it. Sweet cream, a taste I had not known since before the marriage, before the beatings, before the cold exile to the snow. I held it as if it might shatter, as if it were something holy. I wanted to thank him, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I bowed my head, letting the warmth of the fire and his quiet presence settle over me. The days that followed carried a rhythm we had not spoken of, but somehow shared. When he worked the fence posts, I brought him water and stayed to hand him nails. When the girls cried late at night, he rose first, pacing the floor with them in his arms until they calmed. He never asked for thanks, never demanded anything in return. It unsettled me more than cruelty ever had. One afternoon, I found a book on the mantel. Its cover was worn, its pages marked with underlined verses and notes in faded ink. Inside was written, "To James, from your mother for when silence gets heavy." When I looked up, he was standing behind me. "I didn't know you read scripture," I said softly. "Only the verses that feel like songs," he replied. I smiled despite myself, and in that moment, for the first time since I had been tied to the post in the snow, I felt something stir inside me. Something dangerous. Something fragile. Hope. The thought came slow. Each day, I saw more of the earth appear through the snow patches of brown soil, the first hints of green pine needles freed from ice. My daughters grew louder, their voices no longer weak whimpers, but sharp cries demanding the world notice them. For a time, I let myself believe it might last, that the cabin, the fire, the quiet rhythm of days could keep us hidden. But peace is a fragile thing. It always cracks under the weight of what hunts it. I saw them first. I was standing at the window with a cloth in my hands when 3 riders emerged through the morning fog. The sight froze my blood. One wore a brown coat I knew too well. Matthew, my husband's brother. The other 2 were cousins, men with scarred hands and eyes colder than winter. Each carried a rifle. The cloth slipped from my fingers. My hands shook. My daughters stirred in their cradle, sensing the storm before it broke. James stepped out onto the porch before they reached the gate. He didn't carry his rifle. He only leaned against the post, arms crossed, as if this were any ordinary morning. The riders halted 10 paces out. Matthew spat into the dirt, his eyes never leaving the cabin. "That woman inside belongs to our family," he said, "and those girls carry our blood." James didn't move. His voice, when it came, was calm as frost. "She's not yours. She's not a thing to claim." Matthew's jaw tightened. "She was married to my brother. Those brats carry his last name." James's eyes narrowed. "Then your brother should have stayed alive." The words cut sharper than any blade. One of the cousins shifted in his saddle. The other cocked his rifle. Matthew's voice dropped low. "Don't want trouble, rancher. We came to take what's ours." James pushed off the post and walked toward them. No gun in his hand, no anger in his step, only intention, heavy as stone. "You ride down this hill now," he said softly, "or I bury 3 more men before supper." The air cracked with silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Matthew's gaze flicked past him, toward the window where I stood frozen. His lips curled into a sneer. "She ain't worth it. Women like her ruin good men." James didn't blink. "She's still more woman than you'll ever be. Man." That did it. Matthew yanked his reins, turning his horse sharply. The cousins followed. Slowly, the 3 silhouettes vanished into the mist, swallowed by the trees. James stood there a long moment, watching the empty trail. Only then did he turn back inside. I hadn't moved from the window. My breath fogged the glass. My arms crossed tight across my chest. "I didn't ask you to fight for me," I whispered. His eyes met mine, steady and kind. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because no one should ever have to beg to be left alone." My throat burned. I swallowed hard. "They'll come back," I said. "And next time, they'll bring more." He nodded once, no fear in his face. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the fire, twisting the hem of my dress until the fabric threatened to tear. The twins slept soundly, unaware. James sat near the hearth, sharpening his blade, his movements slow and deliberate. "I don't belong anywhere," I whispered into the silence. "You belong here." I looked down, tears blurring my vision. I've never belonged anywhere. Not with my husband, not in his family's house. I was something to marry, something to breed. That's all. He crouched beside me then, one hand resting near the cradle. His voice was firm, steady, unshakable. "You're not something," he said. "You're someone." The words pierced deeper than any wound. And for the first time in years, I believed them. After the riders left, the air in the cabin felt different. Not lighter, never that, but taut, like the silence before a storm breaks. I tried to move as if nothing had changed, rocking my daughters, mending their clothes, humming the old Apache songs under my breath. But every creak of the trees outside set my heart racing. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. James said nothing of the encounter. He reinforced the door, set a new lock on the back window, and spent longer than usual cleaning his rifle. But he also built a playpen for the girls out of spare boards and brought me a spool of yellow thread from town. Protection and tenderness carried out with the same quiet certainty. I knew what he was doing, shielding not just the cabin, but the fragile thing that had begun to grow inside it. One night, unable to keep it in, I whispered across the firelight, "You don't know what it's like to be treated as nothing more than a burden. To hear, again and again, that your daughters are curses, that you should have died instead." James didn't look up from the knife he was sharpening. His voice came slow, steady. "I know what it's like to be stared at like a riddle no one wants to solve. To be told your silence makes you wrong. To have people turn away because you don't fit their measure." I stilled. His words were not pity, they were truth, spoken like he had carried them for years. He nodded toward the cradle. "But I know this. Those girls are not curses. They're proof you survived. Proof that life can rise even where men meant to crush it." My breath caught. No one had ever spoken of them that way, not once. Later, I found him outside, hammering new posts into the fence line. Without a word, I picked up a bucket of nails and stood beside him, handing them one by one as he worked. The wind bit cold at my cheeks, but inside, something steadier than warmth grew. That evening, when the twins would not settle, James took one into his arms and paced the cabin, murmuring words too soft for me to hear. I watched, stunned, as her cries faded against his chest. When he laid her back beside her sister, he looked at me across the fire as though seeing me for the first time, not the bruises, not the scars, but me. I did not know what to do with that gaze. It both terrified and steadied me. Later, when he stepped outside into the snow, I sat in the firelight with the twins and realized something had shifted. For months, even years, I had felt like a shadow, surviving in someone else's house, in someone else's world. But here, in this small cabin with one man's silence and two daughters' cries, I felt something impossible. I felt seen. The season began to turn, not with thunder or sudden warmth, but in whispers. Ice melted from the roof's edge in slow drips. A bird sang once from the pines and then fell quiet again, as if testing whether the world was ready for its voice. The snow loosened its grip little by little, patches of earth showing like freckles on the land. Inside, our days took on a rhythm I had never known before. The twins babbled now, their little hands reaching for anything within grasp. James had carved them small animals from pine rabbits, a bear, a crooked-tailed horse. He left them on the windowsill without a word. When I found them, I ran my hand over the smooth wood, marveling at the quiet care in each cut. I began to move with steadier steps. I fetched water, folded cloth, mended what could still be saved from my torn garments. My hair, once tangled and heavy with neglect, I tied back with a faded ribbon James had brought from town. Each time I caught my reflection in the tin basin, I almost did not recognize the woman looking back. Her cheeks held color again, her eyes no longer hollow. Yet beneath it all, fear still lived. Every knock of wind against the cabin wall made me flinch, expecting riders to return. At night, I sometimes woke with my heart racing, certain I'd hear my husband's kin outside the door. James never spoke of them, but I noticed how often he checked the locks, how he stood long at the window before dark. One morning, while tending the fire, I dared to ask, "Why do you live alone, James?" He didn't answer right away. He wiped his hands on a rag, then said simply, "Some men are better quiet." I wanted to press, to ask if he had lost someone, if he had chosen solitude or been driven into it, but the words caught in my throat. His silence felt sacred, and I did not wish to break it. Still, something grew between us, unspoken but real. When I stumbled carrying the bucket, he caught my arm, his grip strong but gentle. When the twins cried late into the night, he rose first, pacing the floor with them until their fists unclenched. And when our eyes met across the fire, there was no judgment, no pity, only a steady recognition, as if he had been waiting for me long before he knew my name. One evening, I stepped outside with the girls in my arms. The thaw was creeping fast now, the air sharp but not cruel. I looked at the cabin, its roof patched, its porch mended, smoke curling from the chimney. It no longer looked like a place I was hiding. It looked like a place where roots might grow. I held my daughters closer. For the first time, I allowed myself to whisper a thought I had never dared. Maybe we could stay. Spring crept closer, though the mountains still held snow on their shoulders. The cabin warmed quicker each morning, and the twins learned to laugh small, bubbling sounds that startled me with their brightness. For the first time, their cries did not feel like burdens. They sounded like life itself. James rode out most mornings, always returning by dusk. He never said where he went, but he sometimes brought back cloth, flour, or a small tin of something he thought I might like. One day it was sweet cream, another time a bit of yellow thread. I began to suspect he was not just trading in town, but keeping my presence quiet, shielding me from the gossip that spread like wildfire in small places. But silence can only hold back so much. It was Mrs. Evelyn Parrish who came again. She arrived on her mule, bonnet stiff, lips pursed like she had bitten into something sour. She carried a basket on her arm, the cloth covering it far too neat for the vinegar jam she always brought. "Well," she said, eyes scanning the porch where the twins' clothes hung to dry. "I see the rumors were true. You're still here, and alive, no less." I held the cradle tighter. "Yes," I answered simply. Her gaze slid toward the cabin door. James always was a strange one, but folks don't take kindly to a man hiding a woman and two babes with no name. It makes tongues wag. My name is Ioka," I said firmly. She sniffed, unimpressed. "Names mean little without rings or kin. Best remember that." She set the basket down sharply on the porch rail. "Tell James I brought flour. He'll need it, feeding 3 mouths that aren't his." With that, she turned her mule and rode off, leaving behind the sting of shame that clung hotter than fire. That night, I could not eat. I sat long after the girls had fallen asleep, staring at the flames, hearing Evelyn's words repeat in my head. "No name, no ring, no place. They'll never stop reminding me I'm not welcome," I whispered. James, who had been mending the hinge on the door again, didn't look up. "You're welcome here." I shook my head. "Not in this town, not in any town, not anywhere." He set the hinge down gently, his voice even. "I don't answer to towns." His words should have comforted me. Instead, they unsettled me. Because, as much as I wanted to believe him, I knew what the weight of other people's eyes could do. I had lived under them all my life. But then, he looked at me long, steady, unflinching, and for a moment, I felt something shift. Not the world outside, not the town's whispers, not the cruel weight of judgment, but the ground beneath me, as if I had a place to stand. Maybe, just maybe, that was enough. When we reach the quiet end of this story, it is not the danger that lingers most, but the tenderness that grew in its shadow. A young Apache mother, cast aside and left for dead, found in an unlikely stranger not just rescue but recognition. And together, through silence, firelight, and the steady rhythm of survival, they created something more lasting than fear, a home. The heart of this tale is simple, but it runs deep. In a time and place where women and children could be treated as burdens, and where silence was mistaken for weakness, we are reminded that dignity is not given by the world, it is reclaimed by those who dare to stay, to nurture, to believe they are worthy of belonging. For anyone listening tonight who has ever felt overlooked, unwanted, or pushed to the edges of community, there is a quiet lesson here. You are not something, you are someone. And sometimes, healing begins not with grand speeches, but with the steady presence of another soul who refuses to walk away. This story also speaks to the choices we all face, even today. Perhaps your life has not taken you to a snow-covered cabin or a frontier town, but you may know the weight of judgment, or the struggle of raising children without enough support, or the silence of grief. And just as James tended the fire without being asked, or as Ahioka found the courage to stand again, each of us can choose to meet others with steadiness and kindness. We may never know how far such gestures can carry someone who is quietly holding on. So as you sit with this story, ask yourself, where in your life can you be the steady fire for someone else? Where can you, through small acts of care, remind another human being that they belong? If this story touched you, consider passing its warmth forward, share it with a friend, or hold it in your heart for the next time someone close to you feels lost. After all, a fire shared does not grow smaller, it only shines brighter.